There's a bone sitting in a laboratory in Kanazawa, Japan. It's smaller than your fist. It came from behind the ear of a person who died 8,800 years ago. And when scientists finally sequenced the DNA inside it, the oldest, most complete Jomon genome ever recovered, the results didn't answer the question of where the Japanese people came from. They blew it apart. Here's what the data found. The people living in Japan right now, all 125 million of them, are not primarily descended from the Jomon, the ancient hunter-gatherers who built the oldest ceramic tradition on Earth. Not from the Yayoi either, the farmers who crossed from the continent 3,000 years ago and started the agricultural revolution. No, the genetic profile of modern Japan was shaped most decisively by a third wave, a group that arrived roughly 1,748 years ago during the Kofun imperial period. And the three individuals whose DNA most closely matches every living Japanese person today? They weren't emperors, they weren't generals, they were commoners. Three lower-ranking people buried in Iwate Prefecture whose names no one recorded, and their bones carry the genetic blueprint of a nation. That finding was published in Science Advances in 2022 by Dr. Takashi Gakuhari at Kanazawa University in Japan and Dr. Lara Cassidy at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. They spent years working on 12 ancient Japanese genomes, and what they found didn't refine what we thought we knew about Japan's origins. It revealed that what we thought we knew was describing the wrong chapter entirely. So here's where we're going. We're going to start at the very beginning, with 1,000 people sealed inside an archipelago by a rising sea. We're going to trace what happened when the door finally opened. And we're going to end at a moment that nobody in Japan has ever given a name to. A moment that determined the genetic identity of an entire civilization. Without a war, without a myth, without a single founding story attached to it. If you've ever wondered what we're actually made of, not the story we tell about ourselves, but the biological truth underneath it, then stay with me. Subscribe, because this series goes further than any single video, and this one goes somewhere most people aren't ready for. The story starts with a bone and a sea that rose. When the sea rose. Between 17,000 and 16,000 years ago, the last great ice age was ending. Glaciers were melting, sea levels were climbing, roughly 1 centimeter per year. Doesn't sound like much, but over centuries that adds up to something catastrophic. The Korea Strait, the body of water separating the Japanese archipelago from the Korean peninsula, was widening. A land bridge that had allowed humans to move between the two landmasses was slowly drowning. And then it was gone. Whatever population was on the eastern side of that gap was now, for all practical genetic purposes, alone. The ROH data, runs of homozygosity, in the Ikawazu genome confirm this directly. Dr. Gakuhari's team found something they described as the highest frequency of short ROH ever reported in any ancient genome. That's a technical way of saying something very human. This population had been small, isolated, and genetically self-contained for a very, very long time. The genome isn't just ancient, it's the record of a sealed room. The bone is the lock, and the sea was the key that threw it. But here's what nobody expected. The Jomon weren't primitive survivors scraping by in the dark. They were making pottery, sophisticated, decorated ceramic vessels. Dated to 16,500 years ago, 5,000 years before rice farming reached Japan, before any agricultural revolution anywhere in East Asia. The assumption had always been that pottery came from farming. You settle down, you store food, you need containers. But the Jomon were hunter-gatherers. They never farmed, and they were making the oldest ceramics on Earth. Every museum exhibit, every textbook that connects pottery to agriculture, the Jomon disprove it completely. The technology existed before the theory that was supposed to explain it. This discovery was sitting in the archaeological record for decades. Nobody made the full connection until the DNA confirmed what the pottery was already saying. So here's the picture taking shape. A population of roughly 1,000 people, not 1,000 families, 1,000 individual human beings, sealed inside an island chain by rising water 15,000 years ago, making art, making tools, making children, without any genetic contact with the rest of humanity, for 15,000 years. And then someone crossed the water, the Yellow River Valley. That's been the answer for 70 years. If you open any textbook about ancient Japan, any museum guide, any documentary made before 2022, the story is the same. Wet rice farming was developed in the lower Yangtze River Basin. The Yayoi people brought wet rice to Japan. Therefore, the Yayoi came from the Yellow River Basin. The logic was clean. The conclusion was wrong. Dr. Lara Cassidy's team tested this directly. They ran genetic affinity comparisons between the Yayoi individuals and populations from the Yellow River Basin, the people who actually invented wet rice agriculture. The result was statistically clear. No significant affinity, not a little less, not marginal overlap. The genomic connection between the inventors of rice farming and the people who brought rice to Japan simply wasn't there. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of everything the textbooks predicted. The actual source of the Yayoi's continental ancestry turned out to be the West Liao River Basin, northeast China. Populations from the Amur River region, steppe and river ecology, hundreds of kilometers north of the agricultural heartland. These weren't rice farmers by origin. They were Northeast Asian populations who had adopted rice farming relatively recently as a borrowed technology and then moved. The recipe traveled further than the cook. Think about what that means. Japan's entire agricultural foundation, the rice, the paddies, the farming culture that shaped everything from cuisine to calendar to religion, was introduced by people who were themselves recent converts to farming. One generation removed from the steppe, carrying borrowed technology across borrowed water into an island that had been sealed for 15,000 years. And here's where it gets genuinely strange. When the Gakuhari team looked at the two Yayoi individuals from northwestern Kyushu, the entry point for every continental wave, right on the coast facing Korea, those individuals had been classified for decades as Jomon-like. Their skeletal morphology, their bone structure. Archaeologists working with those remains for years had consistently described them as indigenous-looking. But their DNA says they were approximately 50% continental. Two people who looked like they belonged to the land they were buried in, and genetically, half of them had come from somewhere else entirely. The archaeologists who classified those bones weren't wrong. They were using the wrong instrument. What does it mean to be replaced by someone who looks exactly like you? Replaced, but not erased. Not yet. At the Yayoi contact zone in Kyushu, the genomic data shows something that almost never happens in world history. The Jomon held their ground. The admixture ratio at the earliest Yayoi sites runs at roughly 50 to 60% Jomon ancestry, 40 to 50% continental. Half and half. A draw. That almost never happens. In Britain, when Neolithic farmers arrived from the continent around 6,000 years ago, they replaced the indigenous hunter-gatherers at rates above 90%. In some regions, the indigenous signal essentially disappears within a few generations. That's the normal pattern. Farmers arrive, numbers overwhelm, the older population fades into the genomic record. But in Japan, at the precise moment of first contact, the Jomon were still standing at 50%. Whatever was happening in those coastal river valleys, those first generations of Yayoi farmers and Jomon hunter-gatherers living alongside each other, it was not a takeover. It was a negotiation. This isn't just ancient history. This is in living people right now. And some of them might be you. Dr. Gakuhari's team put the Jomon component in present-day Japanese at 15%, plus or minus about 4. That sounds like a small number. Run it against 125 million people, and you get 18.75 million individuals currently walking around with Jomon mitochondrial haplogroups, genetic signatures found almost nowhere else on Earth. Almost extinct as a distinct lineage, but not quite. The Ainu people of Hokkaido carry Jomon ancestry at roughly 70%. The Ryukyuan people of Okinawa at around 28%. And here's the part that moves this out of the ancient past and into right now. Japan only officially recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people in 2019. Not 2019 years ago, the year 2019. After centuries of forced assimilation, land appropriation, cultural prohibition. The genomic map that shows the highest Jomon ancestry and the political map that shows Japan's most marginalized minorities, they are the same map. Actually, before we go further, I want to ask you something directly. If you've ever taken a DNA ancestry test, drop in the comments, what did it actually say? Did the result match what your family always told you? Because honestly, your answer might be more connected to what we're about to discuss than you think. Now, the Jomon are at 15%. The Yayoi period produced a 50-50 balance at the entry point. So what happened between those two numbers? What cut the Jomon contribution from 50% down to 15%? Because it wasn't the Yayoi. The Yayoi left the Jomon at almost half. What did the cutting came later? And it has no name in any founding story. The state was forming. And for a moment, the data genuinely suggests this. It was forming from both sides. During the Yayoi period, across the centuries of rice paddies and contact and children born to mixed families on the southwestern coast of Japan, the Joman held at somewhere between 40 and 55% of the overall genetic makeup. That number didn't stay at the entry point 50%. It declined slowly over generations, but it held. It did not collapse. The Jomon were present in the genome of Yayoi period Japan in a way that defied the pattern everywhere else on Earth. There's a specific person in this dataset who makes this real. A woman buried at a site in northwestern Kyushu about 1966 years ago. Her nuclear genome is approximately 50% continental, but her mitochondrial haplogroup, the lineage that traces through mothers, is M7A1A4, fully Jomon. Her mother's line, going back as far as it goes, is indigenous to this archipelago. She is half continental by DNA and entirely Jomon by matriline. She is what coexistence looks like in a skeleton. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. For 6 centuries, something like a balance held, and then the Kofoon period began, around 300 CE, quietly, without conquest narrative, without any mythological event attached to it. Without a founding hero whose name Japanese schoolchildren learn. 3 individuals from Iwate Prefecture, whose remains were sequenced for the 2022 study, carry mitochondrial haplogroups common throughout present-day East Asia, a Y chromosome dominant in mainland China, and a nuclear genome that doesn't model as Yayoi plus Northeast Asian. It models as Yayoi plus Han Chinese, a different continent in the data, a door that opened without making a sound. And here is where the textbooks have been wrong for 40 years. The Yayoi migration, the agricultural revolution, the Korean Strait crossing, the rice paddies spread across Japan. That event is what every documentary and every museum exhibit blames for diluting Joman ancestry. The Yayoi are presented as the moment of transformation, the genetic crime, if you want to call it that. But the Yayoi left the Joman at 40 to 50%. What reduced the Joman to 15% wasn't the Yayoi. The Yayoi are innocent. What cut the Joman by a factor of 4 came after. It came during state formation. It came without a myth, and it came from a direction nobody was looking. The Kofoon wave arrived alongside keyhole-shaped burial mounds the size of mountains, Chinese bronze mirrors buried with the dead, Korean iron, Chinese characters inscribed on swords. The material culture of the Kofoon period looks like a civilization being rebuilt from the ground up. New architecture, new technology, new political structure. The question genetics had to answer was whether all of that new material came with new people. The answer is unambiguous. Dr. Gakuhari's team ran affinity tests between the Kofoon individuals and 59 distinct populations from across the ancient world. Of 59 candidates, only 3 populations produced a confident genomic fit: Han Chinese, Korean, and Yellow River Late Bronze and Iron Age individuals. All 3 carry heavily East Asian ancestry derived from the Yellow River Basin and its immediate periphery. The Kofoon individuals model as a 2-source mix, roughly 70 to 80% Yayoi ancestry and 20 to 30% new Han-adjacent East Asian. A new source. Different from the Amur River populations that sourced the Yayoi, from a different direction, carrying a different ancestral composition. 2 waves, 2 separate continents, 6 centuries apart. There are 3 things this study found about the Kofoon source population. The third one has never appeared in any documentary. The admixture dating puts the Kofoon migration event at 1748 years before present, plus or minus 175 years. And the modeling requires two separate pulses to fit the data, not one continuous flow. Two distinct demographic events, first the Yayoi wave, then the Kofoon wave, each from a distinct source, each leaving a distinct genetic signature layered inside the modern Japanese genome. The Jomon at 40 to 50% after the Yayoi period. Then the Kofoon pulse arrives, large enough, sustained enough, and the Jomon dropped to 13 to 15%, 4 times smaller, in 6 centuries. Not through violence, through the mathematics of a large migration meeting a smaller existing population. The math of reproduction, played out across 200 years of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Actually, if you caught our last video on ancient DNA migrations, you already saw the beginning of this corridor. The same Northeast Asian populations moving east, pushing toward the coast. What did you think when you saw that? Did it change how you look at migration history? Drop it in the comments, because what we're about to cover next is exactly where that story leads. And here's what makes this story different from any other ancient migration you've ever heard about. The 3 Kofoon individuals whose genomes anchor all of this, JPIW32, JPIW31, JPIW33, were not buried in the Great Keyhole Mounds. The study authors are explicit about this. They were lower-ranking people, commoners, and the elite who presided over the transformation those commoners represent, buried in mounds that cover more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza, have never yielded a sequenceable genome. Not because no one has tried, because the Imperial Household Agency of Japan restricts excavation access to imperial tomb sites. The ruling class that oversaw the largest genetic shift in Japanese history is, by policy, off-limits to science. The science stops at a gate. So let's say it clearly, out loud, the way the data actually says it. The dual structure model, Jomon plus Yayoi, has been the foundation of Japanese origin science since the 1980s. It's in the school curriculum. It's in every genetics paper that cites Japanese ancestry. It's in museum exhibits across Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto. And it is not false. But it is describing a stage of Japanese history that was later overwritten. The Japan in the dual structure model no longer genetically exists. It existed during the Yayoi period, and then the Kofoon happened. Here is what the Gakuhari study actually says in plain terms. The Kofoon individuals and modern Japanese individuals are, and I'm quoting directly here, almost indistinguishable from one another. That's not a soft finding. That's not a caveat-laden academic suggestion. That is 2 populations separated by roughly 1,400 years, plotting in the same place on a principal components analysis. The Kofoon are not the ancestors of modern Japanese. They are, genomically, the same people. The transformation was already complete by the time the Kofoon period ended around 700 CE. Whatever Japan was going to be, genetically, it had already become it. And now the question that the data forces you to ask. The Kofoon elite, the people in those enormous keyhole tombs, the people who commissioned the Chinese mirrors and the iron weapons, the people during whose rule this demographic transformation happened, who were they? Were they the new arrivals? Were they the remnant Yayoi aristocracy absorbing the wave? Were they something in between? We don't know. We cannot know. The DNA that might answer that question is locked behind a government policy that has stood for over a century. The Imperial Household Agency has never permitted excavation of the Great Kofoon. Think about what that means. The most consequential genetic event in Japanese history, the event that shaped the genome of every living Japanese person, was presided over by people whose DNA we are not allowed to study. The workers left their bones. The rulers left their mounds. And the mounds stay closed. There are people alive right now, 125 million of them, whose genetic profile was determined by this nameless wave. And there are people alive right now, the Ainu, the Ryukyuan, whose higher Joman ancestry sits on the edges of that same country, recognized as indigenous only in the last few years, after centuries of policies designed to make them disappear. The genomic fault line and the political fault line are the same line, drawn 1700 years ago, still active today. Let me tell you something about this study that doesn't appear in the press release. The 12 ancient genomes in the Gakuhari dataset are extraordinary. They span 8,000 years of Japanese prehistory. They answer questions that took decades to formulate, but there's a gap in the record. And the gap isn't an oversight. The gap is the story. Not one of the 12 individuals was recovered from a keyhole tomb. The Kofoon elite, the people who built the largest human-constructed earthworks in the ancient world, people buried with enough bronze and iron to fill a museum, contributed nothing to this data set. 3 commoners represent the entire Kofoon genetic period, and those 3 individuals happen to cluster with modern Japanese more tightly than any other ancient population sampled, which means we are making conclusions about the genetic identity of a civilization based on the DNA of people whose names were never recorded, buried in graves that no one built monuments to. The elite left architecture. The commoners left science. And here's where the absence becomes the loudest thing in the room. We cannot tell from the current data whether the Kofoon rulers were themselves part of the incoming continental wave, or whether they were a surviving Yayoi aristocracy that managed and directed a demographic transformation they didn't genetically share. The shape of the political question, who was in charge, who moved those people across the Korea Strait, who decided that the archipelago should receive a new population, cannot be answered. Not yet. Possibly not ever if the tomb restrictions hold. What we do know is this. The Jomon's effective population size was approximately 1,000 people for multiple millennia. 1,000. That is a number so small that a single bad winter, one failed harvest, one epidemic moving through a coastal village, could have ended the lineage entirely. The haplogroup N9b, currently carried by millions of living Japanese people, came within a plausible range of extinction multiple times across its 15,000-year history. The thread held. It held because of luck as much as biology, because of contingency, because of 10,000 small, unmemorable decisions by people who had no idea they were preserving something that would eventually constitute 15% of a nation's genome. The Jomon survived the isolation. They survived the Yayoi contact. They contracted to 15% under the Kofoon wave, and then stopped contracting. For 1,400 years, the number has held. That number is not a relic. It is a living signal in 18 million people right now. There's one more thing the 2022 study found, and this one is personal. The AMY1 gene, salivary amylase, encodes the enzyme that begins breaking down starch the moment food enters your mouth. Populations with long agricultural histories carry more copies of AMY1. Their bodies have evolved over generations to process starch more efficiently. The Yayoi individual in the study carries more AMY1 copies than the Jomon individual. The Jomon's AMY1 profile is lower, older, the genomic signature of a population that never needed to process grain because they never grew it. Modern Japanese people carry elevated AMY1 copy numbers. Every bowl of rice processed efficiently by a Japanese person's digestive system is, at the molecular level, a consequence of an agricultural migration that happened 3,000 years ago. The Yayoi didn't just bring rice to Japan. They brought the biological equipment to eat it. And that equipment is still running in the bodies of people living today, passed down through 150 generations, written into the cells lining their mouths. And the Jomon AMY1 signature, the lower copy profile of a population that spent 15,000 years eating fish and deer and gathered roots, is still present in modern Japanese DNA at approximately 15%. 15% of Japan is still at the level of a single enzyme, a hunter-gatherer. They just don't know which 15%. This is the part where it stops being ancient history, because if you have any East Asian ancestry, if your family traces back to Japan or Korea or the regions of Northeast China that fed both the Yayoi and Kofoon waves, then the story we've been telling for the last 30 minutes is not a story about other people. It is a story about the biology currently operating inside you. The migrations that happened 3,000 years ago, 1,700 years ago, are not in textbooks and museums only. They are in your saliva, in your mitochondria, in the haplogroup your mother's mother's mother carried out of a place that no longer has the same name. We talk about ancient DNA like it belongs to the past. It doesn't. It belongs to right now, to you, to the 18 million people alive today who carry the last recoverable signature of a 1,000-person civilization that survived 15,000 years of total isolation on an archipelago in the North Pacific. The Jomon didn't make it into the founding myth. No emperor claims them. No national holiday marks the moment their lineage began contracting. There is no stone in any Japanese city with their name on it, but they are there, in 15% of every living Japanese person. In the Ainu elder in Hokkaido, whose people were forced to abandon their language within living memory. In the Ryukyuan fishermen in Okinawa, whose islands have been disputed territory for decades. In the enzyme in your mouth that breaks down the rice you ate today. The DNA secret isn't that Japan has a complicated past. Every civilization does. The secret is that the most important moment in Japan's genetic history, the moment that made modern Japanese people who they are, happened without a name, without a myth, and without anyone in power acknowledging it happened at all. It happened in commoner graves, in 3 sets of bones in Iwate, in the quiet arithmetic of reproduction across 200 years of a dynasty nobody remembers founding. And the people who might be able to tell us more, the ones in the keyhole tombs, the ones who built a civilization on top of a transformation they presided over, are still locked away, behind a gate, under a policy, preserved in their mounds while the question they could answer sits outside, unanswered. The Jomon survived 15,000 years of isolation. What they couldn't survive was the silence that came after.